Business anchor Devon Murugan interviewing the Finance Minister a little earlier. For some analysis of Mr. Nene's speech, I'm joined in studio by Alex Smith. He's an economist at FNB. Thank you very much for joining us, Alex.
My pleasure.
Now, did Mr. Nene say enough to give the impression that government is going to be able to avoid greater fiscal slippage?
Yes, no, absolutely. I do think so. In fact, I think he probably surprised markets a little bit on the positive side. I mean, the bottom line is that revenue has been coming in too low because the economy has been underperforming. And in that environment, government has actually opted to increase taxes and also to cut spending. And the result is a forecast budget deficit that's virtually the same as it was in February, which I think is actually a very, very good achievement given the difficult domestic and international economic backdrop.
Now, we observed that as Mr. Nene made comments around economic growth, downwardly revising the outlook to 1.4% as opposed to 2.7% earlier in the year. We saw that the rand did fall by some few cents. How did the rand react in general to his speech?
It seemed to be pretty stable, actually. Look, I don't think anyone was surprised by the GDP growth revisions. The SABC has already told us a similar story. A lot of the private sector economists, including myself, have been sort of forecasting those types of growth rates for a while now, so the Treasury was a bit behind the curve. But I think what was positive was that the bond market actually rallied on the back of this announcement. The fact that the government is serious about their fiscal deficit targets and serious about getting a deficit of below 3% in that 2016-2017 fiscal year, which is something that they've been aiming at for a while now, is very, very important. And I think that, you know, we often look at the bond markets as a very important indicator of a piece of economic news because bond traders tend to be quite sophisticated. And I think the fact that there was a rally in the bond market is a positive signal for the Finance Minister.
Now, there was a lot of anticipation around what Mr. Nene would say around funding for Eskom. I'd just like us to take a look at what he said around that.
In addition to Eskom, several other state-owned companies are under Cabinet's very close scrutiny. A new framework is envisaged that will distinguish commercial activities from development mandates, accompanied by a more stringent financial reporting requirements. Following the successful restructuring of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, steps to address financial risks and improve governance are being undertaken at SAA, South African Express, the South African Post Office, and the Land Bank.
Okay, well, he was speaking more broadly about parastatals and basically saying that there's going to be a framework designed to actually address the issue of parastatals that are struggling financially. What do you think should be a general approach for government with these parastatals?
Yes, look, I think government needs to be a lot more harsh on the management of these parastatals. They need to act as the private sector would if spending, you know, goes way over budget or if things aren't delivered on time. I think management needs to be held accountable for that. And it's important because it is ultimately the taxpayers' money that in many cases is being wasted. What we saw today with regards to Eskom is that government will actually be selling what it calls non-strategic assets and providing a capital injection of some 20 billion rand into Eskom. Now, these assets are typically income-generating assets and assets that grow in value over time. So we would hope that by selling these very functional assets and injecting capital into Eskom, government will be getting bang for its buck. And that's a bit of a concern because in the past, there has unfortunately been a few spending slip-ups at Eskom, which has actually cost us a lot of time in terms of generating power capacity, and it's also cost the taxpayer a lot of money.
Now, we've heard rumours about the government considering selling its stakes in Vodacom, Telkom, those sorts of assets. But once they sell those off, they're gone forever. What other assets, government assets, do you think they could sell to try and fill the gaps of other parastatals?
Well, look, I mean, I don't think government necessarily wants to be selling off all the loot in the treasure chest, as it were, because these are very, very good assets. Particularly the listed assets, Telkom and Vodacom, they've increased in value quite substantially over the years, and they've paid some very healthy dividends. I suppose the other question really in terms of asset sales is, the privatization of some of these state-owned enterprises. And indeed, perhaps that's a better route to go, because the assets of, say, Telkom and Vodacom have been very good to the government, whilst the state-owned enterprises are costing government money at this stage. The problem, of course, is that state-owned enterprises that are running at a loss are obviously not very attractive to the private sector. So privatization in that sense becomes tricky, because I'm not sure whether people will want to buy them in their current format. So at this stage, I think asset sale options are relatively limited, but it's more about getting increased efficiency out of the state-owned enterprises and turning them into profitable enterprises, which they certainly have the potential to be, in which case you'd want to keep all of them and let them generate revenue for the fiscus, rather than being a drain on the fiscus.
It was very interesting. The minister seemed to more than hint that government will not be able to entertain public sector workers' demand of a 15% hike. How do you see that fight panning out?
It's certainly going to be an interesting one. Look, South Africa has unfortunately had a very poor history of labour relations over the last couple of years. Most of which has been in the private sector, but now the focus shifts to the public sector. Minister Nene has emphasized on a couple of occasions that if the current wage settlement is in excess of, say, CPI +1, which is what has been budgeted for, it's likely that there will actually have to be cuts to the headcount in the public sector. And he also announced headcount freeze from this moment on for the next 2 years. So it's going to be a real battle, I think, between unions and government. And obviously the waters are muddied by the fact that COSATU is part of the tripartite alliance. So government is essentially going to be battling with itself if there is a disagreement over wages. But I think it's very important that government draw a line in the sand and say, look, this is what we can afford, and we're not prepared to go any further. Not just in terms of the fiscus, but also in terms of sending a message to labour unions that right across the economy, whether it be the public sector or the private sector, we need to take a stand, and we need to attach productivity and wage growth. We can't just give like huge wage increases over and over again if there's no productivity attached to that, because ultimately it's eroding South Africa's competitiveness.
I'm slanting slightly into political territory, but presumably this is, the time is ripe for government to stick to its guns, given the fact that there's so much division in COSATU right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps the timing is good. But I think the bottom line is that government simply has no alternative. Unfortunately, for too long now, public debt levels have been rising and rising. And just because the economy is underperforming, the government doesn't have any more fiscal space. So the real imperative right now is to make sure that the economy picks up, because without that, the fiscal burden is just going to increase and increase. So the main focus here has to be generating longer-term GDP growth. And one of the most important ways of doing that is by creating a more stable labor environment, and by, as I say, attaching labour increases to productivity growth. So I think if the public sector can lead the way in that, it will send a strong message also to the private sector.
Alex, so much more to talk about, but not much more time. Thank you very much for your time. That was Alex Smith. He's an economist at FNB. Let's take a look at how the markets performed today. More business news coming up after